Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
My good friend John tipped me off to a story in Hemmings, and this is interesting, and this is the kind of thing that will affect a lot of people in several industries. The EPA is launching a crackdown on emissions defeat device makers. Daniel Stroll wrote the article, and what we're talking about is, the EPA governs, among other things, tailpipe emissions on cars. And so most cars, brand new, the tailpipe emissions are very, very heavily regulated and monitored by, among other things, the EPA. So there are people out there who make devices to allow you to defeat the emissions issues on your car. And this, thinking way back, there was a time, for instance, when people didn't like, catalytic converters. So they'd remove the catalytic converter and put in a straight pipe. And there were companies that sold those pipes, so they said, these are test pipes. These are not actual for, daily use. And I also remember when, say, unleaded gas first started becoming a thing, people, to save a couple cents a gallon, would punch out the hole that the gas nozzle went into in the filler and make it so you could put a regular thing in there. And again, people have been thinking about these kinds of things, but this one is interesting because after finding dozens of aftermarket parts companies in violation of the Clean Air Act for selling emissions defeat devices last year, the EPA has announced that it will step up enforcement against these companies and clamp down on any aftermarket parts designed to bypass emissions controls, whether intended for on or off-road use. And that's one of the other excuses they use. They'll say, well, we're going to sell you this, but it's not for driving on the road. It's for off-road use only, or experimental use, or testing or something. The announcement came after the EPA reached its most recent settlement with an aftermarket company, in which it found a company in Florida to have sold more than 20,000 devices that included hardware components and electronic tuning software known as tunes that hack into and reprogram a motor vehicle's electronic control module to alter engine performance and enable the removal of filters, catalysts, and other critical emissions controls that reduce air pollution. So you might say, well, what's that mean when the EPA comes after you? What does it do? Is there any practical effect? Well, the owners of the company had to dissolve the company. They were ordered to pay a civil penalty of $850,000. They surrendered all the software and source code they used to create the devices in question. And this issue appeared to focus largely on diesel-related products, including EGR delete tunes. Susan Bodine, the EPA's Assistant Administrator for Enforcement and Compliance, said in a statement, "The EPA will vigorously pursue and prosecute companies who attempt to circumvent emission controls that are required to reduce air pollution. This case illustrates why stopping the manufacture, sale, and installation of aftermarket defeat devices is an EPA national compliance initiative." Some of the other aftermarket companies the EPA has pursued enforcement against over the last year also specialized in tunes and other products for diesel engines. For selling tunes largely for heavy-duty diesel engines, another company was ordered to pay a civil penalty of $1.1 million in September for selling catalytic converter delete aftermarket exhaust systems. And another company was ordered to pay a $612,000 penalty in March. And for selling catalytic converter delete aftermarket exhaust systems, a company in Nevada was ordered to pay a $10,000 penalty in August. Now, some of you are wondering what's with the penalties. And the EPA has the authority to penalize companies and people that violate the Clean Air Act. Now, if you want to, you can appeal these penalties and you can wind up litigating these things in court. The question is whether it's worth doing that, because if you're going to lose, it just means you're going to wind up paying even more after you're done paying your attorneys. Of course, if you think you're being wrongly targeted and you think you can win, take it to court and win. See what happens. In addition, the EPA secured settlements against a number of companies that sold parts for gasoline engine vehicles over the last year. Among them, one in Nevada, which paid a $270,000 penalty. A California-based company, which paid a $25,000 penalty in April. Another company in California paid an $8,500 penalty in March. And California-based company, which paid a $5,000 penalty in August. All were for selling either tunes or catalytic convert delete exhaust components. So there's companies all over that are popping up on the radar of the EPA, and it's costing them. In all, the EPA secured settlements against 42 companies just in 2019, more than in any single year in the past decade, and a 40% increase over 2018. Since 2010, the EPA has secured settlements against 298 companies for Clean Air Act violations involving vehicles and engines. According to the EPA, its National Compliance Initiative, which will focus on stopping the manufacture, sale, and installation of defeat devices on vehicles and engines used on public roads, as well as non-road vehicles and engines, is slated to run through 2023. Some of the actions I just told you about were part of that initiative. As the EPA notes, doing this will reduce the source pollutants, including those that cause smog and things like nitrogen oxides, various toxic air pollutants such as cancer-causing benzene, carbon monoxide, particulate matter or soot, and greenhouse gases. In addition to adverse effects on the environment, these pollutants are responsible for asthma, heart disease, and other illnesses. The Senior Director of Federal Government Affairs for SEMA, which is the Specialty Equipment Market Association, said that SEMA is following the National Compliance Initiative. And the quote is, "The EPA has always had the authority to enforce clean air laws on any emission-related parts that would take a vehicle out of compliance. But the initiative does confirm the EPA's recent increased level of review and potential enforcement. According to SEMA's guide on this, it's up to aftermarket parts manufacturers to obtain certification that their parts don't fall afoul of the Clean Air Act's requirement not to tamper with emission controls. Generally, any product that affects airflow into or out of the engine, impacts the containment or delivery of fuels, or affects the functionality of an emission control system or device must demonstrate emissions compliance to be considered legal for street use. That includes, but is not limited to, intake systems, exhaust components, tuning products, intercoolers, turbos, and superchargers. In addition, SEMA warns that selling any aftermarket parts with the disclaimers for off-road use only or for racing use only is essentially meaningless if the part can be installed on a highway vehicle." So that's one of the things that you often see, where somebody will sell a part, they'll go, for off-road use only, for racing use only. Those aren't get-out-of-jail-free cards. And it's kind of like when you see somebody repost something on YouTube and they go, "Well, I'm not claiming the copyright on this." Doesn't matter if you are. It's not what the rules say. So if you make the part and you sell the part and the part allows this to happen, you might run into problems with the EPA. And it sounds like a lot of companies were simply just staying below the radar, doing their thing, and hadn't gotten caught yet. What could possibly go wrong? Well, you could get caught. And then when you get caught, you might find yourself paying a fine of $850,000, a civil penalty. So it's one of these things where it's an industry that's operated for quite some time in the shadows. And these things are out there. All you got to do is flip through, flip through a magazine. What? Look at the newspaper. No, there was a time when, not so long ago, when there was magazines that were devoted to these things. All those things have migrated onto the internet now. But you can find companies that sell all kinds of stuff that make your vehicle faster, more powerful, louder, smokier. Rolling coal, anybody? And so these devices are being sold, and a lot of people just assume, well, hey, it's right there, I can buy it. They couldn't sell it if it was illegal, could they? Well, until they're caught, yeah. I mean, and it reminds me of the time when you could buy the satellite devices that would allow you to watch satellite without paying for it. And you could go online and buy these boxes that would allow you to get satellite without paying for it. And then what happened was somebody came along and started litigating that and got a hold of the customer lists from these companies. And every single person who bought one got a letter from the company saying, hey, understand you got this and it's against the law and you now owe us a ton of money. And I know people who got in trouble like that. So that's a little different because that's where they went after the end users. Here they're going after the manufacturers. Now, they could get you, presumably, because putting the device on your car does break the law. Depends on which state you're in and whether or not you're going to get caught. But the EPA has decided, well, it's much easier to go after companies that manufacture this stuff. So there have been, tunes for cars for quite some time. I remember a client who had chipped his car. That was another word you often heard, where you could replace a computer chip inside one of these control modules, and it would change the performance characteristics of the engine. And even those can run afoul of this. So it's an interesting article. If I was in the business of manufacturing aftermarket parts for cars that affected anything about what flowed through the engine, going in or coming out, you got to be very, very careful. Make sure your stuff's compliant, because otherwise you might wind up paying an $850,000 civil penalty. So the company dissolved, and it's out of business. And still there's this penalty out there that's got to get paid. And that's a very, very big penalty. So, John, thanks for sending it. I appreciate that very much. Hemmings published it. Daniel Stroll wrote it. EPA launches crackdown on emissions defeat device makers. We'll keep watching this for updates. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. People who say they don't care what people think are usually desperate to have people think they don't care what people think.